Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for our Burlington House Lunchtime Scientist event. I am Lucinda Offer, Education Outreach and Bicentennial Events Officer for the Royal Astronomical Society. We are hosting this week's event in celebration of our bicentenary this year. May, June marks the part of the year we highlight life. And so today we have Professor Jane Greaves with us, who is an astrobiologist from Cardiff University. And this is so exciting to be learning more on this very interesting science field about life in the universe. But before I introduce our guest, let me make a couple of short announcements first. First, please post your questions in the question boxes provided if you're joining us on Zoom or in the chat box on YouTube, as we are also live streaming from our Royal Astronomical Society YouTube channel. And we will ask your questions after the talk. Second, just to make an announcement, this is for primary students. I know that there's a secondary student thing, but I wanted to share with you what's going on with the Great Science Share, which is helping us, the RAS, celebrate our 200th year. And go to greatscienceshare.org and look for weekly themes to participate. This week is astronomy, geophysics, and space themed. So the Royal Astronomical Society partnered with the Great Science Share for schools to get you lots of fun stuff to take part in. You can even watch our very own Sheila Kanani, a planetary scientist, to talk about what got her interested in space science. So lots of fun going on this week to be had by all ages, and the Royal Astronomical Society is so very much pleased to be a part of it. And of course, for today's event, which is the Burlington House Lunchtime Scientist, we are focusing on 15 to 16-year-olds who have been working hard in their GCSEs this year and want to give them an opportunity to ask questions about science with scientists. So here we go. I am very excited to introduce you to our guest speaker, Professor Jane Greaves, who will share her research on life elsewhere in the universe in the amazing field of astrobiology. And on to you, Professor Greaves.
Thank you very much, Lucinda. It's great to have everybody here today, so I hope you can hear me okay. So what is this astrobiology? Sometimes a bit sarcastically called a subject without a subject, because after all, we don't have alien creatures here that we could talk to or study in some way. But what I want to talk to you about is how we're hoping to find and study exactly that. So let me just check the slides working here. Yeah, great. Okay, so let's go back about 100 years in our history to 1926. So this was a time when people were really confident that there were other creatures out there. I love this magazine cover. So this is an illustration of some crazy intelligent civilization that the author and illustrator imagined existed on Mars, which is our nearest neighbor planet. And I think this illustrates in science, sometimes things go in waves of like optimism and enthusiasm, and then waves of caution. And that's kind of a good thing because we want to do science carefully. But unfortunately for Mars, it turned out in the picture on the right, when there was a real spacecraft flyby of the planet Mars, it was nothing like that. So now in time, this is the year when maybe your grandparents were watching the moon landing. So that was really exciting. But the picture that came back from the Mariner spacecraft flying past Mars was a bit of a word of caution. So there is water there. You can see there are the icy polar caps of the planet Mars, but it really looks really barren in color. And also it turned out the atmosphere is really thin. It doesn't show up in this picture. So that was a bit of a downer. But then things turned a bit of a corner in the next decade. So this picture that you might think is some kind of illustration of some crazy aliens is actually a real image. And this is the time in the 1970s when scientists realized that life on Earth has much more aspects than we realized before. So these are tube worms. They live at the bottom of the ocean, very deep down, many kilometers down. And the basis they use for energy is essentially chemical energy from chemical reactions, and even from the hot lava under the seabed. So it's nothing like the way organisms live on the surface of the Earth. In fact, these creatures live in complete darkness until the submarine's headlights come along. So these are called extremophiles, and it really got people thinking, well, maybe we should think more widely about there are more extreme habitats in the universe where creatures could live really successfully. Okay, so coming on a bit to, we're now talking about the discovery of extrasolar planets or exoplanets outside our own solar system. So if you're watching me speak today and you're about 15 years old, you were being born in, that's 2005, I guess. So 10 years before that, the first planet around a star like our sun was discovered. So this is really expanded. So it's almost routine to discover an extrasolar planet today. That obviously it's still, you know, it's a whole world in its own right. So that's still really amazing. And I know there was a guy in the United States who discovered one the other day. He was doing an internship with NASA and he's 17 years old. And in his first week, he found a planet nobody had spotted before. So this is really exciting to take part in. But some of the real interest is not in all the thousands of planets we've got now, but some of the maybe a couple of dozen planets that look like they might potentially be habitable. Okay, and by habitable we mean, well, they're something like the size of the Earth as shown in this graphic, so they'd have the same kind of gravity, and they're also at a suitable sort of distance from their host star that the temperature on the surface would be reasonably nice. So say that water could be liquid there, which is a really important condition for life as we know it. But what I should really stress that these are not images we've taken of these planets, as you're probably aware. They're just artists' illustrations because we don't have anything like enough information at the moment to take an actual image of an extrasolar planet. Okay, so the giveaway clue here, if you're wondering, is I think the same artist did a lot of these illustrations. So clearly there's somebody there who really likes swirly clouds and blue oceans. And so some of these planets look a lot the same, but they're probably actually very different. So what are we going to do? Now we've got a haul of planets we can investigate. So here's some of the most exciting things I think that are going on. So maybe there's actually a communicating civilization out there. And that's what this array of radio telescopes shown in the picture on the left has been doing for the last few years. So they're actually deliberately listening out for radio communications in case there's a purposeful radio signal from another inhabited planet around maybe one of these planets tens or hundreds of light years away. So the problem with that approach is you might have to be really lucky, because if you think about it, we've been using radio communications maybe like seriously now for mass broadcasts since about the 1950s. So let's say that's 70 years. But we've already moved on. A lot of our communication is now done through optical fibers. So the Earth just doesn't produce as much radio communications as it used to that someone else could eavesdrop on. So if it's that short a window in time, we might be really lucky to hear from another planet that was inhabited that happened to be using radio technology at about the same time as us, given human civilization has been going on for tens of thousands of years, say. So that might be a bit of a needle in a haystack. The one on the right is a really daring experiment. So what's slightly out of picture as I see it is us sending out a powerful laser pulse from planet Earth on the right-hand side that hits a very, very thin plastic light sail. So it uses the pressure of light of photons to push this sail, which is carrying a nano spacecraft, directly to another star system. So the closest planet we know about is around the planet, the star Proxima, which was on the previous slide. And if we could power this light sail up to 20% the speed of light, it'd actually get there in 20 years. And then it could snap a photo that could get back to us in another 20 years. So if we were really lucky and the development of that technology continues in the way we hope it will, we could actually be getting that image back in maybe 50 years from now. So you guys will definitely see it. But again, that's just one planet. So what are we doing a bit more widely than that? So this is perhaps a more mainstream experiment. So this is the proposed Ariel spacecraft, and we're involved here at Cardiff University. Some of my colleagues are working on simulations and technology that will make this mission work. So it's drawn a bit funny in this artist's illustration because it looks like the spacecraft is examining the Earth and looking at this really thin blue skin of atmosphere that we see around planet Earth. Whereas what it will actually be doing is looking for that thin skin of atmosphere around one of these extrasolar planets, tens or hundreds of light years away, and it'll be using the light of their star, not ours, as a backlight to illuminate the atmosphere. And it will look for signatures in the spectrum of that atmosphere to see if there are molecules there that might relate to the presence of living organisms, like oxygen, for example. But you can see from the illustration that's going to be pretty tough to do because the planet is really big compared to the amount that's atmosphere, which is just this tiny layer on the edge. So it may be that Ariel won't be able to discover a planet really like the Earth, but it'll get close. It might find planets little bit bigger than the Earth and be able to study the chemistry of their atmospheres. And maybe the second generation mission after that will get us into this realm of extrasolar Earths. So Ariel's meant to launch in 2028, so a few years to wait yet, but it's very exciting. But that brings us back to what's going on in solar system science at the moment. And I think this is really cool. Okay, so in this illustration of our planets and where they are in terms of habitable temperatures as you go out from left to right away from the sun. There are some other prospects. Thinking back to those extremophiles and their really crazy deep ocean habitat, we can really look more widely. So on the planet Mars, for example, not a great atmosphere, but there might be really simple organisms living below the surface soil where they're shielded from radiation from the sun. There might even be something on the planet Venus. So we know the planet Venus has a really, really hot surface, but it's actually relatively cool in the cloud decks and there is water there. So there might be some kind of floating aerial biosphere. And then finally, as we go a bit further out, there's a lot of excitement about possible habitats within icy moons of the gas giant planets, Jupiter and Saturn. So we know that there's liquid water beneath an ice crust on those moons. So the illustration at the bottom right is the real system, the moon Enceladus of Saturn. And that's a real image of essentially geysers of icy water jetting out from below. And that reflects the fact that there's genuinely an ocean floor potential habitat there. So how might you in the future get involved in some of this? I just wanted to share this nice picture of my research associate, Emily Drabeck-Maunder. So she's a young researcher who was working with me. This is her doing a selfie at one of the radio telescopes we used. So she's now moved on slightly. She's a senior scientist at the Royal Greenwich Observatory, which is in the bottom of the picture. And that's a place you could visit and find out about the work she does now. But what she did in this research project a couple of years ago was we looked at signatures of molecules, particularly methanol, that's jetting out from this moon Enceladus. And she did a really careful study. So again, balancing the excitement, the optimism, and the caution. But she unfortunately found that the methanol wasn't directly from any organisms. It's in a kind of cloud of gas that's sketched here in blue, trailing away to the right. And it's more to do with the interaction outside the moon of the moon and the environment of the planet Saturn. So we thought optimistically that methanol might be something to do with microorganisms that live below the surface. And it turned out when we did the calculations, that can't be the case. But it's certainly an inspiration to go on and do more of these detailed studies. So that kind of brings me to the last thing I wanted to say, which I hope very much is projects that are going to be in your scientific futures. So this is just a sketch at the moment, but it's an illustration of a lander we could send, maybe a joint NASA European, other nations mission to land on Jupiter's moon Europa, which also has these icy jets of water coming out. And if it took drills and sampling equipment and so on, it might be able to find the first evidence that there's definitely some kind of microorganisms outside our own planet. And I think that would be the real foundation of astrobiology as a real science, to find the first evidence of creatures living beyond planet Earth. So thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor Greaves. We do have several questions, and I've just noticed on YouTube that we don't have a chat box available. I have a feeling that might be because we put this as a live stream for kids. And when you do that on YouTube, I have a feeling they have some security issues with chatting as they should. With students of that age. So I apologize, but we do have some questions from Zoom. So we've got some participants here, some students from GCSE age, and really excited to ask their questions from you. So I'm going to go ahead and read them, and they've been voted on. So I'm going to ask the first one with the highest votes. And as I ask these questions, I see some more coming in. So please do ask your questions. This is why we're having this. And if you would like to ask it yourself, if you posted a question, go ahead and raise your hand in the, I think you should have an opportunity to raise your hand if you want to ask it yourself. So the first question, looking for any raised hands. No, I have one from Arian Daga. So Arian Daga asks, to what extent is it worth looking up at the sky and exploring potential life? She says, when we do not fully understand, do not properly care for, and have not taken full advantage of life on our own planet.
Oh, that's a really good question, actually, and a lot of people ask that. So I totally appreciate we need to think about life on our own planet, study it, and indeed care for it. And one of the ways I think about this is it depends a bit what we might find. So I think, for example, if after more years of study, it became clear that the human race was, pretty rare, we weren't getting lots of communications or evidence of other inhabited planets, I think it might in a way make us value each other more, the diversity of our own nations on Earth, different ways people look at things and so on, as well as, as you say, carrying on studying what's on our own Earth. So we don't want, for example, to go to Mars and find that we've destroyed some life there because we didn't recognize it was there. So maybe it was some kind of tiny organism that didn't breathe out some kind of gas we were aware of. And I don't know, we did something toxic and damaged that life. So the more we study, I think, life on our own planet, the more we are aware of the different ways life could exist. And so we can be essentially like careful and respectful of anywhere else we go.
Okay, wonderful. Yes, Mars seems to be where lots of nations are headed, and so that's very, and I know that planetary protection is a really big place of debate and discussion, so really important to think about those things. We have one from one of the teachers in attendance, Dr. Kevin Walsh. He asks, in his recent book, Novacine, James Lovelock suggests that statistically, humans might actually be the only intelligent beings in the universe. Do you agree, Professor Greaves?
I see prodding me for an answer there. I think this is a difficult one because there could be lots of civilizations out there, but it depends a bit on the rate at which life arises on planets. So you're going to expect chemistry is going to happen naturally with all the reactants available on the surface of a new young planet. If that leads really easily to biology, then life might start like inevitably and then develop quickly, and there could be loads of civilizations out there. But there's a lot we don't understand at the moment, and this isn't quite my field of expertise, but for example, the rise of large life forms, multi-celled life, and then really complicated life, like your cat running around the house at the moment, that took a long time ago. So that was maybe only in the last, 15% of the age of the Earth, and we don't really know why that happened relatively late. So there's some real unknowns there. So people have done calculations based on the idea of maybe things proceeding at a similar rate to it did on the Earth, and then tried to work out how many communicating civilizations there might be now in our galaxy, for example. And people who've done this have come up with a number of maybe a few hundred. And I think most people are not coming up with zero unless they're really harsh and the sort of constraints they apply in the calculation. Problem is there's maybe 100 billion stars or something in our galaxy. So a few hundred civilizations could be really, really scattered. And that brings us back to the problem I said of maybe we'd pick up a radio communication, but it might be they sent it out 10,000 years ago. and now goodness knows how they're living. You know, they're totally living in the cloud, and you know, they don't really care about civilizations like us anymore, or something like that. So it's a difficult one to answer.
There are so many factors that are involved, and we're learning more and more about, you know, factors like gamma ray bursts and things. So that could have possibly sterilized galaxies. So there's lots of things that we're still learning. Absolutely, great question, and very interesting too. Okay, so another question by a student here, Oliver Tidbury asks, what to say that extraterrestrial organisms do not rely on water or other biological molecules, but on something else? Is not looking directly for water hinder our search for life out there?
That's a really good question. And I actually tend to agree with you that we shouldn't be quite so parochial and just think about water. So for chemical reactions to happen and have a lot of complexity, like DNA, for example, you need a solvent. And water's a solvent at the temperature on the Earth. But there are other things that could be a solvent in other environments. So there's been some suggestions that on the moon Titan, for example, where it's much colder than on Earth, that methane would be a liquid, and it could possibly use that for a solvent. So there's been some lab and theoretical work on that to see if there's a possible basis of life there. And it can be a bit difficult because something can be a solvent, but the reactions don't happen really fast. So it might take ages for life to get started. But we are trying to think about really widely about this. So even going back to that science fiction idea, people realized maybe 100 years ago that carbon is the backbone of all the organic molecules that are important to us. And like if you go down the periodic table, silicon is the next one, and it forms the same number of bonds. So you could have silicon-based life. It turned out when people have looked into this more recently that that'd be kind of difficult because most of the products of silicon reactions are actually solids. So I probably shouldn't use the phrase exactly as I was thinking of it, but you'd be like excreting bricks if you were a silicon-based organism. That might be really uncomfortable. But yeah, you're quite right. That we really need to investigate and check that there's other life, certainly in the solar system, that maybe has some lifelike patterns. Like, I don't know, we saw the way they were reproduced was like a repeating pattern on the surface of the body or something, even if there wasn't any chemistry that we recognize as life like ours on Earth.
I'm really impressed with all the questions from the students today.
Yeah.
And we've got several more in the queue. So, and we definitely have about 8 minutes left, so we still have time. So here's a really good question from Gemma Thomas. She asks, if a student wanted to get into astrobiology, what should they aim to study at university?
That's great. I think you should probably follow what you're most interested in, because the people I'm working with in astrobiology at the moment, I've got their degrees in all sorts of things like biology, biochemistry, and they study atmospheric physics and things. So I did a physics degree, and then I did a doctorate in astronomy, and that was a really neat way to get into things because of all this we can study with telescopes. But I think don't restrict yourself to a subject that maybe you're not so inspired by. So if you like biology, maybe get into synthetic biology later on in your working life. People are like breeding amino acids in the lab that could be a different basis in life. And I think that's fascinating, though it's hard for me to follow the technical details. So yeah, there's loads of ways to get into it. I think a science with a good like numerical foundation, like physics, chemistry, biology, just maths for doing simulations, that'd probably be really giving you the good tools.
Okay, great question. And that's what this is all about, which is giving information to students in GCSE level who are getting ready to go to university soon. Okay, another question, one from, we'll do this one from Sandra Levy. What do you think about the UAP footage? I apologize, I'm not sure what UAP, released by the Pentagon. What do you think are chances that intelligent life have visited us? So any possibility of that?
Okay, so I don't know, unfortunately, what footage you're talking about. So I'd probably have to send an email answer or something later. I think there's a lot of things on Earth that people are maybe going, oh, that was an artifact left by aliens. But I think perhaps we're a bit, if you're talking about artifacts, we're underestimating what people could do. For example, carvings in the Earth and so on. I think people put a lot of resources into this thousands of years ago. So some of the things that might be interpreted, you know, it couldn't be done by humans. We're just underestimating humans.
That's a really great answer. And it's a common question that humans are curious about. I agree with your answer there. Arian Dega asks, when you use the adjective habitable, surely you do so with respect to our own understanding of life on Earth. For example, with regard to temperature, energy source, presence of water. Is this a fair assumption, and might it disregard potential life outside of our own understanding of how life works?
Yes, we're really trying to relax that assumption, particularly through studies of the Earth. So we know now microorganisms can exist in very salty, very acid, boiling plus water, or water that's temperatures we think of as below freezing, but that are kept from freezing by salt there, for example. So we are trying to think as widely as possible in terms of a temperature range in which any kind of useful chemical reactions could take place. But you're right, there's a difficulty of recognizing kinds of chemical reactions that aren't so common here on Earth. So example, I'm trying to do some stuff with phosphorus chemistries because phosphorus is really important in DNA. It's amazing, you turn out the fundamental paper in some chemical reaction was done in the 1920s or something, and you've got to get some library to scan that article for you. So there probably is things that we're missing. So there's really only 6 chemical elements that are absolutely vital to our biochemistry, but we really should think more about whether some of these elements could be substituted. So for example, arsenic was substituted for phosphorus in an experiment on microorganisms that were in a very extreme environment on Earth. And it turned out that the organisms weren't really using arsenic the way it had been hoped. They were tolerating arsenic's presence. But it does mean that arsenic, if it was really readily available on another planet, might be really useful to organisms there rather than the primary one that we use above it in the periodic table.
Okay, thank you. Here's another great question. A student asks, and this is a good question for the UK, we do a lot of satellites and instrumentation. How do they make sure that the probe is not contaminated and will not kill potential life when we send them out into space or on other planets?
Yeah, there's a huge protocol around this. So you could bathe the spacecraft in very strong ultraviolet radiation, for example. You could put it in vacuum. I'm not at all an expert on this, but there are certainly people who work on this and make really, really sure that everything that goes into a spacecraft that gets launched is really thoroughly decontaminated, because that would be awful to send it to Mars, but then breed our own life there. And in fact, unfortunately, recently there was a mission that was going to the moon that took some tardigrades, water bears, tiny microorganisms with 8 legs. And I think the idea was to make some sort of cache of life off the Earth, which is, to start with, a really neat idea, but unfortunately it crashed into the moon, and tardigrades are kind of robust. So I hope when we next get to the moon, we won't find we drop our can of Coke on the ground and the tardigrades all wake up and go, hey, we're the lunar organisms now.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting. I heard that nobody knew that the tardigrades were on board. So
this is why we as a species want to be really careful and make sure everybody's on board with the plans as much as possible.
yeah. Okay. So this is a really great question about a future as an astrobiologist. What kind of companies are you associated with in your job as an astrobiologist?
Okay, so most of my colleagues work in universities and research institutes that are part of universities. So maybe someone gives some money to say, look into some aspect of astrobiology. So a big donation to say, look at the effects that life would have on atmosphere. I've also got a colleague who works, he's set up his own spin-out company, essentially, and he looks at things like cells and cell death and why our cells die. So biochemistry companies are really, really useful. I mentioned synthetic biology, so you can, do things in a lab that might be dedicated to, I don't know, producing amino acids for maybe some commercial purpose, but could do some work as well on different kinds of amino acids and why there's only a limited number used in life. So yeah, there's definitely opportunities to do something you might think that's like an important scientific job that's of direct benefit to our species, but also to do some more wacky way out there, more thinking about exolife kind of as part of that. So quite a lot of people do that. For example, people in the oil industry can also be looking at evidence of large bodies that crashed into the Earth and left impact craters at the bottom of the sea, for example.
Yes. Okay. Dr. Greaves, I wanted to let you know about the time. We're
Mm.
almost there at the end, but we have a very popular, very interesting subject. People are very much enjoying what you have to say, and they have lots of questions still. So I'm going to leave it up to you. Would you like to continue?
I'm super happy to continue for a bit. I don't want to keep everybody from lunch and that, but obviously you
Yeah.
tune it out whether of you want, and I'm happy to try a couple more questions. Yes.
Okay, fantastic. And if you have to go, don't worry about it. You're more than welcome to go, obviously, and we'll continue to ask Professor Graves these questions, and you can watch them later on the live stream on YouTube. Okay, so continuing on, Neve asks, do you feel like it is important to keep exploring space despite the fact we haven't completely explored our own planet?
I think there's every reason to do both. So our own planet's really exciting. There's obviously mountains people have never climbed, and sometimes you find really interesting things up there. I used to work in Hawaii because there's telescopes on the mountain there, so it was an amazing part of my life. There's a colony there which exists nowhere else, of something called the Wekyu bug, and it's evolved to adapt to very dry conditions, very harsh ultraviolet radiation, and only eat dead bugs that are blown up the mountain. So I think studying our own Earth is absolutely amazing. We didn't know about this stuff under the sea until the 1970s. There's still a lot we don't know about. There are organisms in the so-called lithosphere living in stone, I think that's the name. If you drill tens of kilometers down for other purposes, you find organisms at very high pressure in rock, and they're perfectly happy there in their own habitat. So I think we can do these things in parallel. You know, not everything can necessarily be funded at once. Certainly at the moment, there's maybe higher priorities of funding, you know, medicine. So we come through the COVID crisis, but it's still, you know, I want people to be inspired to say, study the Earth, also study space. We keep having these amazing strings of discoveries. Image of that black hole was incredible. Some of my colleagues in Cardiff were involved in that, so they saw it before I did, and we were like, please show us. And they were like, no, we can't yet. You know, transient radio sources, enormous explosions in the distant universe, that their radio waves come to us. This stuff is really exciting, and I hope you're inspired about it. And even if you go on and do like a perfectly sensible job rather than like a wacky astrobiology job, I hope you'll still carry on being a bit inspired.
Yeah, I think when we explore space, we learn a lot of things about ourselves, our planet, its evolution, you know, and also you know, lots of things about our place in the universe. Just I think just like when we were doing Earth observations, and people wonder why would we want to know about the weather from there? Well, we've learned a lot more than just the weather, and the same thing with exploring the universe. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Some of our techniques apply to different things. So also some of my colleagues are doing Earth observing satellites. So some of the expertise we have in our group at observing at wavelengths of light that aren't visible light enable us to study are there toxic chemicals in the Earth's atmosphere, you know, that kind of thing. So it kind of all links up in a really nice way if you like doing science.
Yeah, it usually always comes back and benefits Earth and humans on Earth. Okay, Cameron Albeck asks, could life really be found at extremes of temperatures, such as on Titan, or near vacuum conditions? Sorry, I said vacuum conditions, such as on Mars.
Yeah, so the vacuum one, there are organisms, certainly anaerobic organisms don't rely on air. So there are certainly organisms that we think wouldn't really mind too much of a vacuum. They'd need to be reasonably robust so they didn't like literally explode. But there'd be some samples scraped off the outside of various space stations, and in fact goes back to accidental contamination. I'm not quite sure how that got there, but they found very durable organisms, the kinds that don't mind living in power stations, nuclear power stations, I believe, were sitting on the outside of the space station and they weren't really doing anything. They were dormant, but when you got them back in, they were intact. And so I slightly lost the point of the question. Could you remind me, Lucinda? Extremes of temperature, wasn't it? Yeah. And so Mars, I think there's temperatures there, they may be a bit transient, where organisms could survive. Sometimes you are really pushing the limits of what extremes of temperature could be survived. So if you ruptured the cell wall, for example, under extreme heat or extreme cold, I think the organism wouldn't be viable. But it's given these things that can survive nuclear reactions and vacuum, I think we really need to think widely. And in fact, one of my colleagues at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Sarah Seeger, has just published some work about, they put some perfectly normal organisms, yeast, into an atmosphere of pure hydrogen, and it really didn't care. I mean, it's used to sitting around in our air, but it was fine when it was hydrogen instead, because it doesn't use the air.
Yeah, so many things we discover about life, like tardigrades, I find so fascinating because their ability to survive many, many things that we would think would be very harsh on life. Okay, Catherine Wilmot, she asks a really great question here about, do you feel it is important for women physicists to be represented?
Oh, very much so. It has been a struggle for women in the past, I have to say, including myself, women my age. I'm in my 50s, that people didn't recognize that we had a voice. And I really hope that's not going to be true of your generations now. And more widely than that, you know, I think there's a really big issue with people hiring scientists they see who look vaguely like themselves, and that really disadvantages minority ethnic communities. You know perfectly well, why wouldn't you be able to do science if you're keen and interested? And so we've really got to recognize that everybody is bringing stuff and everybody's just a person. And, you know, studies of this in sociology have shown that teams that have more diverse people, so women, people from different cultural backgrounds, different ways of perhaps slightly looking at things and communicating what they think, those teams are the most innovative. And so it's really important. So it is very important to me that women don't get kind of squished out of the field, particularly by people who talk over them, for example. We need to be really culturally aware and make sure that everybody's voice is heard and, you know, and celebrated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so impressed and appreciative that more and more women are getting involved in science and the field of physics. Henry asks, would you use an advanced spectrograph to identify specific elements in an exoplanet's atmosphere? And if so, would the information be reliable enough to invest in further experiments on said exoplanet?
Yeah, so the spectrographs that are used both on telescopes on the surface of the Earth and in spacecraft have to be really advanced, because you basically need not to lose any of the photons coming to you, because from that thin skin of the planet, there's very few that are actually traveling to us and captured by us. So there are some special technologies that can be used, blocking out the light of the star, for example, making sure you only get light from the planet. So these are pretty effective. We've got to the point, I think, we're not limited by the way we've built the technology. We're just limited literally by the number of photons coming to us. And that's why the hunt is on for nearer exoplanets. So within about 30 light years, our current technology that we know we can build is pretty powerful for detecting the spectra of these extrasolar planets. So we really want to make sure we don't miss a planet within that relatively small volume that will be interesting to study.
Great. Samuel DeBottom is a pupil, and DeBottom, excuse me, he asks, would you suspect evolution would be the driving force on extraterrestrial life towards complexity or some other process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think evolution is probably the important thing, driven by changes in the environment. So there are very old types of life on Earth that have never really needed to change. Some types of fish, some types of archaic microorganism that have basically stayed the same for billions of years. So this isn't really my field of expertise, but I think if there's no need to evolve, then there are some natural mutations, but if they don't convey much of an advantage, maybe they don't turn into the next kind of creature. So I think it's things to do with the environment that are probably important. Yeah.
Okay, just going to take maybe just this last question. There are several questions up, but we've already run 10 minutes long. I hope that's okay.
I'm happy if people send them in to you, that I can, you know, try and get back to people later as well.
We could definitely probably answer these online and leave them on the Royal Astronomical Society website. Okay, so the last question is a GCSE question, and Karen Parks asks, the solar system is on the GCSE geology syllabus as a key idea and compares the process on Earth to similar processes on other planets. Would you come into contact with many people who have studied geology?
That's a really good question. I see there's one there. Yeah, I do, but not as much quite perhaps as I'd like, because universities tend to be set up in departments that do, you know, physics in one place and geology in another building 2 miles away. So I've certainly got my colleague Janet in the physics department is actually an expert, not so much on geology exactly, but on minerals. So she really knows stuff about rocks, and that's really useful for me to knowing what kind of temperatures have produced different kinds of minerals on Mars, say, or on other planets, and generally in our galaxy. So it's really nice to be able to talk to someone who knows the formulae for minerals and can then explain. You know, it's really important to explain in simple terms. Like she might say to me, well, this means there's lots of magnesium in this rock. That's all you're really looking at here, different kinds of magnesium in rocks. And I can go, well, hang on, not all stars have magnesium, maybe. So we can have a chat about how astronomy and geology or mineralogy interact. Yeah.
Yeah, geology rocks, as they say, and geochemists are fantastic, and especially around the idea of astrobiology, really important to understanding, you know, the chemistry that life may look
Yeah,
like.
I'd say don't be afraid to ask a really basic question. So mine is often, what's the name of this rock mean? But you know, if people ought to be happy to go, well, like, here's how I would explain it to you if you were like 10 years old or something, and that can be a really good starting point.
Yeah, and I have been, I think I mentioned to you, really privileged to be a part of, to work at NASA and be part of Spaceward Bound and doing research around the world on Mars and Titan analogs. And most of the team were geologists.
Yeah, you can see we're really infused
It's
now.
a lot of field science and astronomers and so planetary scientists. And they sort of blur the line between astronomy and geology and all that nowadays. And I think astrobiology is one of those really you can integrate so much science into. It's not just biology and not just astronomy. It's a lot of other things as well. So really fascinating talk. Thank you so much for
Oh,
being
thank
with
you.
us.
And
And
thank
thank
you
you
all
for
for
the
your questions. It's been really nice to think about them.
and thank you to the students who have joined us today. And we will keep your questions and publish them onto the Royal Astronomical Society site. And thank you so much for joining us for Burlington House Lunchtime Scientist. We're going to be doing this every week. So the Learned Societies at Burlington House, I think Linnean Society is next. And then, like we were just talking about geology, the Geological Society will also be doing one. It's going to happen this time, 1 to 1:30 every week. So join us and go to the Burlington House website and find out more information. Thank you, everyone, and take care, stay safe.